So we ended last week's session on how the New Testament uses the Old Testament, and we finished with a passage from Acts chapter 8, not mentioned in the Gospels, but in Acts chapter 8, the Ethiopian official is reading from Isaiah 53 when he is traveling back to his home after spending some time at the temple to worship the living God. And God sends Philip to talk to him, and when Philip comes up on the chariot, he hears him reading out loud, which is a good way to read the Bible. And the Ethiopian is quite confused. He says, is he talking about himself in this passage, or is he talking about somebody else? But he also, when Philip asks him if he understands what he's reading, he says, how can I, unless someone helps me or explains it to me? So, for the next 2 weeks, not counting tonight, 2 weeks after tonight, we're going to be looking at a couple of the Old Testament minor prophets. They don't like being called minor prophets. I don't know who started that, but we'll get to the bottom of this. But we're going to look at probably Hosea and Amos. But we're going to do an introduction tonight. I've had people through the years say, I've tried to read the Old Testament, and one of two things happens. Either it's, over my head, or it's boring. Well, my job is to try to make it not boring. Your job is to pretend that I did that. So, you do a lot of this, so you have no idea what I'm talking about, but you do a lot of this. Yeah, that makes sense, okay? So keep in mind what your part is. Why even bother with the Old Testament? I can't tell you how many times in my ministry people would come out and say, it's nailed to the cross. Did you know that's what it says? But not the entire Old Testament. I give you 3 reasons here in your notes why I think it's important to study the Old Testament. Number 1, and primarily, the Old Testament was the scriptures for the New Testament church. When the New Testament church referred to the scriptures, they were referring to Genesis through Malachi, because the New Testament was in formation and really wasn't collected until the middle of the 2nd century. So the scriptures of the New Testament church was the Old Testament. And if it's good enough for them, it ought to be good enough for 20th century Christians as well. Number 2, if you'll remember in our study of how we got the Bible, I know Larry remembers because he was big on that subject. God went to a tremendous amount of trouble to make sure that the Old Testament was preserved through the centuries. I mean, if you look at it, his providential hand is obvious in keeping record of the Old Testament scriptures through the years until there was a printing press, and finally you can go to Mardell's and get one. But God was involved in that, and I think that's one reason why it's important. Number 3, there is a whole lot to learn about the character of God and the plan of God from the Old Testament. Yes, it gets a fuller treatment in the New Testament, but there's an awful lot of stuff in the Old Testament that would help us to understand what God has been about from the very beginning. We tend to think of prophets as people who told the future. I mentioned last week, the word prophecy, we just kind of go, ooh, like it's some kind of mysterious thing. And a prophet is some kind of mysterious guy who talks about a future that nobody else knows about. There is so little in the prophets about the future as we think it would be the future, and especially in our times. There's so little in there. Nearly all of what the prophets said had to do with the day in which they were living. Now, the closest thing to prophecy and all of that is you better change your ways or you're going to get it. Now, that's foretelling the future, okay? You're going to get it if you don't shape up, and I mean now. So God has been speaking through the prophets to his present day. The primary role of a prophet was to be a spokesperson for God's message in the present day. Please remember that. The primary role or purpose of a prophet was to speak God's message to the present day as to what he wanted from them. So I put in a couple of scriptures here, and I'm sure most of you looked these up. Somebody want to volunteer? Okay, so in Exodus chapter 6, there's some interesting verses in there. I typed them on my paper, but you may have read them. But listen to how this applies to the idea of a prophet being a spokesperson for God. When the Lord spoke to Moses in Egypt, here's what he said to him. I am the Lord. Tell Pharaoh the king everything that I tell you. You tell Pharaoh what I tell you. You be my spokesperson. Okay? But Moses said, I don't know. He said, I speak with faltering lips. Why would Pharaoh listen to me? Then the Lord said to Moses, a little bit more sternly, I added that, see, I have made you like God to Pharaoh, and your brother Aaron will be your prophet. I have made you like God to Pharaoh, and Aaron will be your prophet. He's going to be your spokesperson. I told you to tell things to Pharaoh. You say you can't do it, so let Aaron be your prophet in terms of relaying the message that you say you can't do. Then the Lord's, there's just a couple more words. You are to say everything I command you, and your brother Aaron is to tell Pharaoh to let the Israelites go out of his country. So Aaron becomes the prophet for Moses to speak to Pharaoh. One more, it's in Jeremiah chapter 1. The word of the Lord came to me saying, before I formed you in the womb, I knew you. Before you were born, I set you apart. I appointed you as a prophet to the nations. So God recognizes Jeremiah, always has, as a prophet. Alas, sovereign Lord, I said, I do not know how to speak. He understands as soon as God tells him he's a prophet that he's going to have to do some speaking. And the reason he gives is, I am too young. Now, I'm probably too young to teach this class, as a matter of fact. But anyway, I'm struggling through. But the Lord said to me, don't say I'm too young. You must go to everyone I send you to and say whatever I command you. Do not be afraid of them, for I am with you and will rescue you, declares the Lord. The prophet says what God tells him to say to the people about the present conditions in which he lives and what he's expecting from his people. In that sense, prophecy is really equivalent to what we call preaching or teaching. Thought I'd prophesy a little tonight. But you'd be disappointed. It's just stuff that I always do. Prophecy is like preaching in our day. This is what Amos heard from his audience in Amos 7:16. Do not prophesy against Israel, and stop preaching against the house of Isaac. Stop prophesying, stop preaching. They were the same thing. They're parallel lines. They understood that when he got up to preach, he was prophesying in the sense of speaking for God what his message was to the church. And I mentioned a couple of verses in 1 Corinthians 14 that you can look at your leisure, where Paul says, tongues are good, but prophecy's better. Because when a man prophesies, he speaks for the edification of people. That's why prophecy is better than tongues, according to 1 Corinthians chapter 14. Now, most of the influence of the prophet was felt during what we call the divided kingdom. Now, I could just take for granted that you know what that means, the divided kingdom, but maybe I won't. Okay? Now, some of you have longed for me to draw my map, which I haven't done lately. You who are new are in for a treat. As a child of 4 can plainly see, this is Palestine. This is the Mediterranean Sea over here. This is Galilee, and this is dead. And this, of course, is the Jordan River.
The Dead Sea.
Pardon?
The Dead Sea.
Yeah, the Dead Sea, or just dead. Thank you, Paul. So anyway, Jerusalem sits right about here. So you have Saul, the king, first, and then you have David, and David is blessed by God, and his kingdom expands. But then under Solomon, my goodness, the kingdom just went everywhere, you know. That was a heyday for Israel under Solomon. But near the end of Solomon's reign, because Solomon was ruling with an iron fist, there was a rebellion against Solomon. It was led by a fellow named Jeroboam. Okay? That's going to be on the final. They don't think there is a final, Paul. The rebellion was led by Jeroboam. And God sent his prophet to Jeroboam to tell him that he was going to be successful. And that most of the tribes of Israel would one day be under his rule. And Jeroboam probably thought that was going to happen right away. Well, guess what? It didn't. His rebellion was put down, and he fled. What's this country down here? Anybody know? Egypt. Thank you for knowing that, whoever did. He fled to Egypt and hung out there until Solomon eventually died. When Solomon died, Jeroboam came back and kind of became the spokesperson for the majority of the Israelites. Stay with me now. There's a point to all of this. Most of you, anybody not know this story? Well, why am I wasting my time, Paul? So Rehoboam, who is Solomon's son, comes to the throne, and Jeroboam comes to him and says, you have got to lighten up on the people. You're killing us with this heavy-handed rule. And he says, in 3 days, I'll tell you what I'm going to do. So he gets together with his counselors. And he says, you know, there's been a request that I lighten up a little bit from my dad. And they said, that's a good idea. You need to lighten up. If you want to keep this kingdom going, you're going to have to back off a little. He said, thank you for that advice. And then he went to the young bucks and said, what do you think I ought to do? And they said, double down. If Solomon was tough, you're going to be a lot tougher. Tell them that your little finger is bigger than Solomon's wrist, which is an interesting way to put it. And guess who Rehoboam listened to? The young bucks. And he started a rule that was almost tyrannical. So much so that Jeroboam, who had been unsuccessful, led another rebellion, which was successful. And so now you have a boundary here. This is Jerusalem, between the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom, and the southern kingdom is made up almost exclusively of one tribe, Judah. You got a little Benjamin down here, but who cares, you know. Benjamin and Judah, and up here you've got the other rest of the tribes, and there are obviously a lot more people up in there. Now Judah's a big tribe, but all of the other ones, Jeroboam gets to rule. And unfortunately, Jeroboam, because he was stupid, started to build, yes, Sid? No, Jeroboam. No. Jeroboam, well, Rehoboam was stupid because he didn't listen. But Jeroboam was stupid, and he started building worship places up here and kind of mixed in a little Baal worship with Jehovah, just for variety. It's amazing that how quickly the Israelites started incorporating Baal and Jehovah together like it was no big deal. Apparently they had never heard the "you shall have no other gods before me" of the Ten Commandments. And so pretty soon the northern kingdom was a mess. So when you read, starting with Jeroboam and Rehoboam, for the next 6 centuries, 5 centuries approximately, you have these prophets showing up and preaching to the people. Sometimes they preach to the northern kingdom, sometimes they preach to the southern kingdom. But most of the prophets occur in the time of the divided kingdom, with the border being right here. Questions on that? Okay, good. I wanted you to know where it came from. So, prophets sometimes get called seers, S-E-E, not like Sears and Roebuck, S-E-E-R. They are called seers, they are called servants, they are called messengers, they are called men of God. And the phrase you often read when God is referring to them, he calls them my servants, the prophets. My servants, the prophets. So, you have these prophets during these centuries talking to the various kingdoms, telling them what they're doing wrong. Now, there arose a school for prophets, like a seminary, I guess, where you could go say, I think I'm going to be a prophet. And you would go enroll. I better turn off my phone because it's going to ring, I know. You could enroll in this prophet school, like a seminary today, and when you graduated, you would be one of the prophets. However, the prophets who graduated often preached messages which did not originate with God. Can you imagine that? Well, they could. Jeremiah 23, verses 16 through 18. This is in your notes. This is what the Lord Almighty says. Do not listen to what the prophets are prophesying to you, for they fill you with false hopes. They speak visions from their own minds, not from the mouth of the Lord. They keep saying to those who despise me, the Lord says you'll have peace. And to all who follow the stubbornness of their hearts, they say, no harm will come to you. You're good, you're fine. But which of them has stood in the counsel of the Lord to see or to hear his word? Who has listened and heard his word? So apparently, once you graduated from prophet school, you could kind of polish up a few messages and deliver them to the people. And God says, it might have been a good idea to check to see if that's what I thought. Because apparently they weren't doing that. Doesn't it make you wonder what they were studying in prophet school? Gestures? Tone? Time management? I got 22 minutes to get this sermon in, What are they studying? I don't know. But one of the basic things they should have been studying is, don't say, this is what the Lord says, unless the Lord has told you that. But God says, they don't do that. They don't do that at all. Now, these graduates of the prophecy school were sometimes called sons of the prophets. Sons of the prophets. Amos distanced himself away from that group of people. And I wanted to read you a passage, and you have to understand it in the context of the fact that there is this group of people called the sons of the prophets who are graduates of the prophet school. So Amaziah says to Amos, get out, you seer. That's the northern kingdom, and he's from the south. Get out, you seer. Go back to the land of Judah. Earn your bread there. That means get a job. If it's a preaching job, fine, but get a job. Earn your bread there and do your prophesying there. Why? Don't prophesy anymore at Bethel, because this is the king's sanctuary and the temple of the kingdom. But Amos answered Amaziah. Here comes the point I want to make. Listen closely. I was neither a prophet, and the NIV says, nor the son of a prophet. Now, I happen to tell you, this is my personal belief, you have the right to be wrong, that he's not talking about his father. He's not saying, I'm not a prophet and my dad wasn't a prophet. What he is saying is, I'm not a prophet and I'm not one of the sons of the prophets. In other words, I didn't go to prophecy school. I was not enrolled in seminary. So don't even think about me as one of the sons of the prophets. That's not who I am. And then he explains who he is. I was neither a prophet nor the son of a prophet, but I was a shepherd. And I took care of sycamore fig trees. But the Lord took me from tending the flock and said to me, go prophesy to my people Israel. So Amaziah, the priest, says, you don't belong here. And Amos says, but I do. Because God commissioned me down here, and we'll study that next week, Amos, and told me to come up here and to preach to you. So, he's not a prophet. He's not one of the sons of the prophets. He just happens to be an agricultural kind of guy. We're going to emphasize that when we talk about Amos. If you can already start to form the image in your mind of Amos. You think of him in blue jean coveralls with a straw. Okay? That's who Amos is as a person. But we'll study that next week, Lord willing, and the creek don't rise. Now, there are certain characteristics that we see in those who are commissioned to speak for God. I'm not talking about the graduates of the prophesying school. I'm talking about the guys whom God specifically chose to preach his message to his people. Number one, they had a strong sense of the divine call and the backing of God. A strong sense of the divine call. I've had people ask me, did you have a sense of being called? And when I gave my answer, they thought, that's not really much of a calling. But I understand. They were hoping maybe I'd had a vision in the night. No, I wanted to go to heaven, and I thought, well, who's the most likely person to... The preacher! How's that for a calling? Not good. Okay, well, these prophets had a great sense of the divine call, and the best one is in Isaiah. And I gave you this passage in Isaiah 6, verses 1 through 8. Some of you probably read it, but many didn't. So I'm going to tell you, it begins by saying, in the year, this is important, in the year that King Uzziah died. Uzziah was a good king. But this was the year in which Uzziah died. And Isaiah was hanging out at the temple. I don't know why he went there. Maybe he was, I don't know. But when he was there, it says, I saw the Lord on his throne. In the temple, I saw, and then he said, and in addition to that, there were seraphs flying everywhere. You know what a seraph is, right? That's a creature that's got 6 wings. Isaiah said with 2 they were covering their, I don't know how they saw, with 2 they were covering their face, and with 2 they were coming with feet, and with 2 more they were flying around the temple. That's what Isaiah saw. Now, I've been in some pretty nice sanctuaries in my life, but I've never seen anything like that. I saw God enthroned with all of these angelic creatures flying around the temple. And they were crying to one another. Do you remember? Anybody? So you didn't read it? Is that what you're saying? Holy, holy, holy. That's what they were crying. Is the Lord God Almighty. And Isaiah's reaction is not surprising. He went, oh my, I am ruined. I am a man of unclean lips. I live among a people of unclean lips, and now my eyes have seen. Do you know what the next two words are? If you don't say it. The King. In the year that King Uzziah died, I saw the King. This is the true King of Israel, and he has been ever since he chose Saul to be his representative. That's why God told Samuel, yeah, go ahead and make Saul king. They haven't rejected you. They rejected me from being king over them. But he saw the king in the temple with all of these seraphs all around him. And you know, they have this conversation. God says, you know, I wish there was somebody that I could send to the people to get my message to them. I wonder who I could send. And Isaiah said, here I am, send me. Send me. We're not going to go into it, but God says essentially, yeah, that'd be great, but hey, don't expect much. You'll do preaching, but they won't listen. It's always nice to be upfront about that, isn't it? Yeah, you can have a ministry, but it'll be an unsuccessful ministry, but I want you to go. So they had a strong sense of a call. All of the prophets did. And that call was always a reminder that whatever I'm doing with the backing of God. So I've got to do it. Number two, their ongoing contact with God was marked by honesty. They had conversations with God in which they were very honest about their feelings. One of my favorites is in Jeremiah chapter 20. This is after Jeremiah was told to preach, and when he did, they just berated him into the ground. And Jeremiah says to God, you deceived me, Lord, and I was deceived. You overpowered me and prevailed. I'm ridiculed all day long, and everyone mocks me. Now, I got down a couple of times during my ministry, but I never said that to God. You bullied me, is what he's saying, into preaching. And then when I say, okay, I'll do it, look at what I'm facing. They make fun of me all the time. He says, whenever I speak, I cry out proclaiming violence and destruction. So the word of the Lord brought me insult and reproach all day long. But he finishes up by saying, but if I say, I will not mention his word or speak anymore in his name, his word is in my heart like a fire, shut up in my bones. I am weary of holding it in. Indeed, I cannot. He said, I decided, well, if they're going to be like that, I'm just not going to preach anymore. But he couldn't stop. The word of the Lord was like a fire inside it. He had to speak. But there was always these honest conversations. And I've always encouraged people during my ministry, don't be afraid to be honest with God when you talk to him. He knows what you're thinking. You know, I'm so mad at God. Thank you, Lord. No, he knows. So be honest with God. The prophets always were. Number three, they were outspoken and uncompromising in their message. Did I put the word perhaps obnoxious in your notes? Well, that wasn't very nice of me. Perhaps Amos is best at that. I've been upset with churches before, but I've never said this. Hear this word, you cows of Bashan. You cows of Bashan on Mount Samaria. You women who oppress the poor and crush the needy and say to your husband, bring us some drinks. See, you think I'm making that up. It's right there in the text. Amos chapter 4, verse 1. He calls them cows. I think the worst I ever used was heifers. I'm not sure.
And here it calls them fat cows.
Fat cows? Oh, now you've gone to meddling. I'll have to check the Hebrew on that. I don't know. But anyway, fat cows are cows. I'm sure those ladies didn't appreciate it. But that was the state that Amos, the farmer, was called up to the big city life of North Israel and saw these women laying around on their couches going, hey, bring me a drink. Now, whoa, cows of Bashan. So, very straightforward in what they say. I wouldn't recommend that to preachers today. I just have you know that. I don't think it'll work. Number 4, their message, though often one of despair, came from a broken heart. If you read the prophets fairly, you can't help but see that. Yes, they're upset with the people, but they're their people. This is my people. This is my country. They're supposed to be serving my God. What has gone so terribly wrong? They are upset when they give the message. And I wrote down a New Testament reference, even though it's not by one of the prophets. And if you looked at it, in Matthew chapter 23, Jesus absolutely lays low the city of Jerusalem, and especially their leaders. Oh, he pronounces a series of 7 woes. Woe to you for this. Woe to you for that. He lets them have it. But notice what he says when he gets to verse 37. Oh, Jerusalem. Jerusalem, killing the prophets and stoning those who were sent to you. How often I have longed to gather your children together as a hen gathers her chicks under her wings, but you were not willing. After letting them have it, his feelings are clear. It kills him to have to say that. He wants to gather the people like a hen gathers her chicks and protects them. But they said, we're not having any of that. You were not willing. So Jesus, even in his words of condemnation in the New Testament, had the same kind of heart for his people as the prophets who spoke words of condemnation to the people of his day. Looking at the time, we're doing so good. I want to talk to you about some of the ways in which the prophets relayed the message of God. Sometimes they spoke in what scholars call oracles. I'd call them sermons or sermonettes. I hesitate to tell you this, but sometimes they're just about 20 seconds long. Not an hour. There may have been times when they spoke for an hour, but they're not recorded. Now, and in these oracles, sometimes they're oracles of doom, and sometimes they're oracles of hope, depending on the situation. I put down one of the oracles of doom from Amos. He was a doom kind of guy. Hear this word, Israel. This lament that I have taken up concerning you. Fallen is virgin Israel, never to rise again. Deserted her own land, with no one to lift her up. This is what the sovereign Lord says to Israel. Your city that marches out 1,000 strong will have only 100 left. Or your town that marches out 100 strong will only have 10 left. You guys think that you're such good fighters. You know what? You are in for a whooping. That is called an oracle of doom. Most of the churches today would rather have oracles of hope. Like this one. Jeremiah 33, the days are coming, declares the Lord, when I will fulfill the good promise I made to the people of Israel and Judah. In those days and at that time, I will make a righteous branch sprout from David's line. He will do what is just and right in the land. In those days, Judah will be saved, and Jerusalem will be in safety. This is the name by which he will be called the Lord our righteousness. Yes! That's an oracle of hope. But you have to see in Jeremiah's context where that is spoken, what is going on when it is spoken. Oracles of doom, then oracles of hope. And you would think that prophets would rely mostly on sermonettes to get their message across. But they were invented, these prophets. Now don't nap through this, because all of these will be on the final. I forget how many there are. Six ways in which the prophets shared their message. Number 2, the prophets would sometimes give historical reminders of what God had done previously. Where do you think they might refer to in wanting people to remember what God did? Anybody? The Red Sea. Exactly. God's faithfulness to Abraham when Abraham was barren, or without children, put it that way. You remember what he did for Abraham? Anything else?
Food.
Feeding them in the wilderness. Exactly. Taking them into the land to conquer it. You weren't big enough to do that, but with God you were. So what they would do is say, remember what God did. Remember what God did. Remember what God did. Hopefully that they will see, remember what God can do now. It's not like he's a different God. It's not like he's lost his strength. He can still do great things. You've just got to remember. And in many places the prophets talk about what God had previously done. Number 3, the prophets also introduced allegories, which are called something else in the New Testament. Parables, good for you. They're like parables, allegories. My favorite is in Isaiah 5, 1-6. The most obvious, I think. This is an allegory. See if you can figure out what the prophet is saying. I will sing for the one I love. That's God. Not Josephine. This is the one I love is God. I will sing a song about his vineyard. My loved one had a vineyard on a fertile hillside. He dug it up and cleared it of stones and planted it with the choicest vines. He built a watchtower in it and cut out a winepress as well. Then he looked for a crop of good grapes, but it yielded only bad fruit. Now, you dwellers in Jerusalem and people of Judah, judge between me and my vineyard. What more could have been done for my vineyard than I have done for it? When I looked for good grapes, why did it yield only bad? Now I tell you what I'm going to do to my vineyard. I'll take away the hedge. It'll be destroyed. I'll break down its wall, and it will be trampled. I will make it a wasteland, neither pruned or cultivated, and briars and thorns will grow there. And I will command the clouds not to rain on it. Then the prophet, because he's a good preacher, makes the application. He says, the vineyard of the Lord Almighty is the house of Israel. And the men of Judah are the garden of his delight. For he looked for justice, but saw bloodshed. For righteousness, but heard only cries of distress. The message is clear. Look what I've done, and look what you've become. How can that happen? but he tells it in terms of an allegory. Now, Paula, I like number 4. I'm glad you're here to hear number 4. Paula has accused me sometime of being sarcastic. I don't know where that comes from.
It's your native language.
But sometimes the prophets were sarcastic with the people. And I wish there was a sarcastic font that we could put in the Bible. Actually, I wish there was sarcastic font that I could use when I post on Facebook. Because every once in a while I'm sarcastic. And Paula says, they won't know. I go, well, I should figure it out. Here's what he says in Amos chapter 4, 4 and 5. Go to Bethel and sin. This is the prophet speaking for God. Go to Gilgal and sin even more. Bring your sacrifices every morning, your tithes every 3 years. Burn leavened bread as a thank offering and brag about your free will offerings. Boast about them, you Israelites, for this is what you love to do. Now, does God really want them to sin? Does God really want them to boast? No. But he uses sarcasm to point out that's exactly what they like to do. You may have noticed once in a while, I guess about every 3 lessons, I might say one sarcastic thing. But I have the prophets who stand in my corner on that. I have an example to follow in that. Okay. Now, I'm going to mention this one, and you won't like this one. It's a play on words that the prophets used. And they're throughout the prophecies. A play on words. But when you translate from the Hebrew text into English, what happens to the word plays? They disappear. One of the very best ones of all is at the end of the passage that we read just a second ago, at the end of the passage in Isaiah about the vineyard. It says in English, and I read this for you, I looked for justice but saw bloodshed, for righteousness but heard cries of distress. Well, in Hebrew, and I'm not going to do the whole thing in Hebrew, just the last words, because that's really what's important. He says, I looked for mishpat, justice, but I found mishpat, bloodshed. See? And the people went, oh, that was a good one. That was good. And then he says, I looked for righteousness, tzedakah, but I found distress, tza'akah. Close, right? That's the whole point. This is God said, I looked for this, but I found something close to it in terms of what the word sounds like, but it's the exact opposite of what it should be. And word plays were very, and I looked in Paula's Bible because she has a study Bible, I said, did they make that distinction about the word play in verse 7? No. And if you have a Bible that does, you should congratulate your Bible. Because that's an important thing. The prophets, here's one of the reasons why that's important for the prophets. You go, well, so what? Well, when they went home, God was looking for tzedakah, but only found tzedakah. Oh, I'll remember that. You ever have a preacher use word plays? Sid, you remember Bailey? George Bailey? George Bailey. He was big on word plays. I remembered several of them. I'll just mention 2. He said promotion is 2/3 motion. But my favorite, I don't know why it is, but it is, he said there's a great big U in the middle of lust. Isn't it amazing that over 55 years later, I still remember that? And if he'd have just said it in a normal sentence, I'd have tried to get that out of my mind as soon as possible. But I can't forget this. And maybe you can't either, John. There's a great big U in the middle of lust. And then he would stare over the pulpit, and all the young guys would shrink down in the pew. It's a word play. And you do it to get people to remember it. This is why tzedakah and tzedakah, mishpat and mishpah were important, because it would help them to remember what the prophet was saying. Word plays. They also use symbolic names. Symbolic names. Now, I know you'll remember from last week, that was sarcasm.
Yes.
Isaiah's children's names. He had 3 kids. Do you remember them?
1, 2, and 3.
Right, Paula?
Yeah.
Daryl, my other brother Daryl. No. Shiar Yashuv. My favorite, Maher Shalal Hashbaz.
Amen.
And Emmanuel, thank you. He had a 3rd child named Emmanuel, which of course means God with us, which was to show to Ahaz, who was trembling in his boots, looking for a foreign alliance, and the prophet was saying, God is with us. Put your faith there. And every time he called Emmanuel to dinner, people were told, God is with us. We're going to see next week, Hosea names children like that. But we won't look at that today because I got to save something for next week. Do you know that Jeremiah's ministry lasted about 50 years? Do you know how many converts he made?
That many?
That many. There is never an inkling in Jeremiah's book, and there's 50-ish chapters, that anybody ever said, Jeremiah, you're right, we need to get our act together. They just laughed at him and made fun of him and persecuted him, and nobody went with him. But there was a priest named Pashur who really gave Jeremiah a hard time. And Jeremiah says, we're changing your name to Magor Misaviv. Got a nice ring to it. And it means terror on every side. Now, you might think that means that he was a terror to Jeremiah, which he was. But in all likelihood, he was warning Pashur that there was going to be terror that was going to surround the city. See, Jeremiah was one of the last prophets who said destruction is on the way. They are going to surround Jerusalem, and you're going to be out of luck. So, should that be on the final poll, Magor Misaviv? I think so, yes. Now, the final thing is symbolic acts. And I like these. I guess, I don't know why, I shouldn't, but I do. The prophets would do things to symbolize what God was going to do. And so I gave you a list of a number of these, and I said, don't read about those. Let me talk to you about it. And then if you want to go back and read them, I think that would be a great idea. In Ezekiel chapter 4, verses 1 through 5, the prophet is instructed to get a big clay tablet and draw Jerusalem on it, and draw stuff that makes it look like it's under siege. I don't know what that looks like. But make it look like it's under siege. And then, listen, I want you to lay on your side, on your left side for, you ready? 390 days. Lay in front of that clay tablet for 390 days, and then, when that's done, flop over onto your right side for 40 days. The 390 days are for the Israelite history of being awful, but just 40 for Judah. Now, people read that and they say, well, that's symbolic. You know, he didn't really have to do that. I don't know. If God told me to lay on my side for 390 days, I'd say, is the mattress good? I mean, it's hard for me to imagine that he did that. But that's exactly what God tells Ezekiel to do. And don't you know, let's assume that he did it. People coming home from work. Is Ezekiel still laying out there? He is. Still laying out there. It's been over a year. Still laying on his side. And I guess there's a message in that for us. There was always a message in the symbolic act. Later on, still Ezekiel, the next chapter, this is right after he's laid there for 430 days. He is told to get a razor from the barber and to shave off his head and his beard. And don't you know how long those would be if you've been laying on your side for 430 days? He said, then I want you to...
Weigh your hair.
I'm not making this up. Get some scales and weigh your hair. Weigh it into thirds. And with 1/3, set it on fire. And he says, I'm glad I got to shave it off before I did that. The other third, take your sword and whack it up into little pieces. And the other third, pick it up and throw it up in the breeze and let the wind blow it away. And the people had said, what you doing, Ezekiel? You've been laying there a long time, and now you're doing weird things with your hair. What's going on? The symbolic act, hopefully, would allow Ezekiel to say, you know the third that I burned? That's going to be for the people who are killed in Jerusalem when the siege starts. They might die of famine. They might die of plague because they're not going to get in and out for a long, 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 long time. 1/3 of the people are going to be dead because of that. And the other third that I cut up into little pieces, those are the folks who are going to die by the sword when they try to escape. And the other third, they're going off into captivity. Throw them up in the wind. Okay? So instead of just saying that, he performs this symbolic act that probably left an impression on the people, so that when they're in captivity, the wife can say, you remember when Ezekiel threw that hair up into the breeze? Well, that's us. Here we are. He was right. I don't have time to do all these, but I do want to do the one in Jeremiah chapter 13. Jeremiah is told to take his underwear and bury it in the dirt in the cleft of a rock. Excuse me? I'm going to do what? It says a linen belt, but it's his underwear. Take your underwear and go to this place. I can't remember the name, it doesn't matter. But there's a cleft of the rock. Get between the rock, dig up the dirt, put your underwear in there, and leave it and go home. And sometime later, he said, go back and dig up your underwear. And when he went back to dig up his underwear, guess what? It was useless and ruined. And he said, that's what's going to happen to this nation. And if I understand why they did stuff like that, when he came back, he went around Jerusalem going, what do you think of my underwear? And they said, that's underwear? It looks awful. It looks ruined. Exactly. And that's what's going to happen to this people. Now, he didn't have to do that, and I don't know why they did that, but they did that. I thought about doing that in this class. But Paula suggested that it might not be the best idea I've ever had. What do you think of my underwear? Well, that's what Jeremiah did in this symbolic act. And then Jeremiah 19, he gets the elders and the priests of the city, and they go out to the valley of Ben Hinnom. Jeremiah brings a big jar with him and preaches a sermon, and then crashes the jar That's what's going to happen to y'all. Just like that jar was smashed, you will be smashed too. And then Jeremiah put in chapter 27, he put a yoke on. You know, like an ox or two ox would wear. He put a yoke on and walked around town like this. And they said, "What you doing?" "I'm showing you what your future is. You are going to be under the yoke of the Babylonians." He could have just told them that, but he performed a symbolic act. The most outlandish symbolic act is what we'll look at next week. When Hosea the prophet is told, "Go find you an adulteress to marry." It's in the book. Go find an adulteress to marry. And Hosea said, "Is she cute?" Sarcasm. And of course the point is going to be, and we'll talk about whether she was an adulteress when he married her or she became one. We're going to talk about that a little bit. But the point is, just as you bear the hurt of having a partner who cares more about having sex with other people than she does about her love for you, that's how I feel about Israel. I took her in good faith to be my wife, and she has gone a-whoring. The kind of pain that Hosea felt is the kind of pain that God felt. Was that really necessary? I don't know. It's in the book. Now, did y'all know all of that?
No.
And I put the scriptures in there so that you can see I've only made up half of them. The other half are true. They're all true. So, Hosea and Amos next week, Lord willing. We only have 2 more classes after today. No spontaneous cheer? Okay, that's good. We will look at Hosea and Amos, and then Habakkuk will be one of the other 2. We'll do 2 each week. Amos, Hosea, and then Habakkuk, and yet to be determined. Paula hasn't told me yet which prophet she wants to cover, so I'm sure she'll tell me soon.
Obadiah.
Obadiah? We could do Hezekiah, John. Remember that one? I can't let him forget that. There is no Hezekiah, remember? Okay, I was just making that up. He's a king, not a prophet. Any questions about all of that? Was it too much?
No.
You got it? So, they preached sermonettes, they named people, including their kids, weird names, and they did symbolic acts and all of that to get the message that God had given them across. No matter how outlandish it was, they said, "We'll do it. We'll preach it. We'll follow instructions." And I'm grateful for that. All right.
Marlis Milton.